After being rescued on Mustafar, Palpatine wasted no time in manipulating Darth Vader with a carefully planned lie. He told Vader that Padme had died by his own hand, carrying with her the pain and guilt that would become fuel for the dark side. Palpatine believed that Vader's hatred and despair would make him more powerful, but he ignored the devastating psychological impact of this revelation. What he saw as a triumph was actually creating deep fissures in the Empire's plans. Padme's death was a weight that Vader could not bear. He kept asking himself how he could have allowed it to happen. All his actions, the alliance with Palpatine, the betrayal of the Jedi, his own downfall, were motivated by her. The idea that he was responsible for her death was unbearable. In Vader's mind, the love he felt for Padme was still as real as the very pain that consumed his soul. In the solitude of his quarters, Vader indulged in long reflections. The image of Padme haunted him, turning his moments of solitude into real emotional torture. He tried to make sense of everything he had done, but every memory brought only regret and emptiness. The dark side had promised him power and control, but all he felt was despair. He even began to question his devotion to Palpatine, although he still couldn't admit it openly. Vader's emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. The further he plunged into the dark side, the more he seemed to lose his clarity and insight. Depression set in deeply, making each day a greater burden than the last. He no longer saw any purpose in the missions given to him by Palpatine, and his mind, once focused and relentless, became a whirlwind of confused thoughts and conflicting emotions. The hatred that had strengthened him was now tinged with sadness, making him unstable and dangerous even to the Emperor himself. It was then, at the height of his grief, that Vader made an unexpected decision. He thought, what if there was a way to bring Padme back? This idea came to him almost instinctively, as a desperate attempt to give meaning to his existence. At first, it seemed an absurd thought, but as he reflected on it, the idea began to gain strength. After all, he was Darth Vader, apprentice to the most powerful Sith Lord in the galaxy. If anyone could defy the laws of life and death, it would be him. The idea of cloning Padme took hold of Vader's mind like a virus, growing and multiplying at every moment. He found himself consumed by this thought, unable to concentrate on anything else. The plan, initially vague, began to take shape in his mind. He visualized a body that was a perfect recreation of Padme, with her memories, emotions, and personality intact. This dream, however unlikely, became his new obsession. Aware that Palpatine would never approve of such a thing, Vader decided to act in secret. He gathered a small group of scientists, experts in cloning, and gave them clear orders: develop a method that could bring Padme back, but without arousing suspicion. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but the need to carry out his plan outweighed any fear of reprisals. This was the only way, in his mind, to make amends for his mistakes. The scientists began their work in secret. Cloning was already known in Coruscant, but what Vader was demanding went beyond that. He wanted not only to recreate Padme's body, but also to restore her essence, her memory, and her own will. The challenge was immense, but Vader was determined not to accept failure. He wanted perfection, and any deviation from that goal was intolerable. As the project progressed, Vader faced growing internal tension. He knew that if Palpatine found out, his life would be at risk and all the work would be destroyed. However, this pressure only strengthened his resolve. He was willing to risk everything to bring Padme back. Each step in the cloning process brought him closer to his goal, but also distanced him from the control Palpatine believed he had over him. As time passed, Vader began to realize that his search for Padme was creating something new within him. The obsession and desperation that had driven him to the dark side were now propelling him in an unexpected direction. He didn't know if what he felt was hope or just another illusion, but one thing was certain: his determination to bring Padme back would change the course of the galaxy forever. The fact that Palpatine planted the possibility of saving Padme in Anakin's mind was undoubtedly the trigger for the obsession that would consume Darth Vader. The story of Darth Plagueis, the Sith capable of manipulating life and cheating death, kept Anakin's hope alive even after his fall. Despite Palpatine's betrayal and lies, The idea that the dark side of the Force could perform miracles continued to echo in his mind. This belief was enough to make him a slave to his own obsession, fueling his hope of bringing Padme back. After weeks of intense research, failed attempts and countless experiments on guinea pigs, Vader's team finally reached a significant milestone. Vader's relentless perfectionism did not accept failure, and he discarded any result that was not identical to the original. But after countless failures, the scientists managed to create a body that seemed to achieve an almost perfect level of similarity between the clone and the original. It was as if the impossible was about to come true. Vader needed something essential to ensure the perfection of the cloning process: Padme's original DNA. With this in mind, he secretly went to Naboo, determined to collect the genetic material directly from her body. The journey was a mixture of anticipation and anguish, and he knew that revisiting Padme's grave would be a test for his already fragile emotions. Still, he didn't hesitate. To bring Padme back, he would do anything. When he arrived at the tomb, Vader stood for a few minutes in front of Padme's headstone. He stared at the spot where she rested, and his emotions came to the surface. A whirlwind of regret, guilt, and hope washed over him. He remembered every moment by her side, the love they shared and the sacrifices he had made in the name of that love. But above all, he saw a chance to right the wrongs of the past, to have her by his side once more. While his team of scientists and droids were carrying out the work of exhuming the body and taking the necessary DNA samples, something unexpected happened. One of the team members commented that Padme had been buried with a volume of tissue in the abdominal region, simulating a pregnancy, but that there was no sign of the remains of a baby. He also said that, from the tissue samples taken at the time, she had died in childbirth. She hadn't been killed by him, as Palpatine had said. That information awoke something dark in Vader. He felt the weight of a new doubt, and an uncontrollable rage began to grow inside him. Bewildered by the revelation, Vader reacted violently. Using the Force, he lifted the scientist by the neck, strangling him at a distance while asking, in a cold and threatening voice, if he was sure of the information. The man, struggling to breathe, managed to confirm. There were no remains of a baby in the tomb. It was clear that someone had staged a funeral that included a false pregnancy. This discovery deeply shook Vader's already unstable emotional equilibrium. The idea that Palpatine might have lied to him about the fate of his child opened an even greater wound. But the fact that someone else was also involved in this simulation increased his suspicions and paranoia. Someone had planned it meticulously, and the doubt about who was responsible was eating away at his mind. This revelation not only intensified his pain, but also reignited his anger and his desire for answers. On leaving Naboo, Vader now carried two obsessions that consumed him completely. The first was to bring Padme back to life, and the second was to discover the truth about his son, who might still be alive. The thought that he might have an heir somewhere in the galaxy filled him with new determination. But for now, he decided to focus on Padme. He believed that her presence by his side was the key to restoring whatever was broken inside him. Vader followed every stage of the cloning process with an almost fanatical dedication. The scientists explained that the recreation process was incredibly complex, requiring regeneration of living tissue that would be combined with the cloned DNA. With each update, he demanded more detail, more precision, and with each progress, his obsession seemed to grow. It was as if he was searching for the one thing that still made sense in his existence. The process was time-consuming and full of challenges. Each organ had to be regenerated individually, and the living tissues had to adapt to the new body. It took weeks for each part to be rebuilt, and time seemed to drag on for Vader. He watched the cloning tank every day, waiting for the moment when he could see Padme's face again. Each day seemed like an eternity, but he was willing to wait as long as it took to reach her. After weeks that seemed like an eternity to Vader, the moment he had been waiting for finally happened. Looking into the regeneration tank, he saw something that seemed impossible. Padme's face was beginning to take shape in the clone. It was as if she was coming back to life, as if every feature, every detail of her expression was being restored before his eyes. Vader felt a mixture of elation and relief, something he hadn't experienced since before his fall to the dark side. At that moment, all his pain seemed to justify the effort. The regeneration process was progressing rapidly, and the clone's skin was now in its final stages of structuring. The body, which had previously been just an undefined mass of tissues and organs, was now becoming something completely human, real. Vader spent hours observing every detail, studying every progress. Every advance was confirmation that his obsession had paid off, and he couldn't look away from the tank. It was like witnessing a miracle. Finally, the big day arrived. The clone's body was completely regenerated and healthy, ready to come out of the cloning tank. The scientists carefully removed it and placed it in an intensive care unit, where it could adapt to gravity and begin to function autonomously without the aid of devices. Vader remained silent, watching the scientists' every move as his anxiety reached its peak. He knew that this moment marked the beginning of a new stage. The process of adapting the clone would take a few more days, as it was essential to ensure that the body was fully functional. In addition, the neuronal process needed time to organize and consolidate the replicated memories of the original body. The scientists explained that the clone's brain structure was identical to Padme's and that, over time, it would be able to access all the memories, emotions, and thoughts that Padme had had in life. This detail made Vader's heart soar even more, fueling his obsession. When the chief scientist finally authorized the clone's awakening, Vader could hardly contain his anticipation. He was positioned outside the room, watching everything through the glass. Every movement inside the room seemed to drag by in slow motion. He could see the scientists adjusting the apparatus, preparing the body for the crucial moment. The tension in the air grew with every moment, and Vader remained motionless, his fists clenched, as if every second was a test of his patience. Then the long-awaited moment happened. The clone opened his eyes. The room fell completely silent as the scientists monitored her vital signs and began to interact with her. At first, she seemed confused, which was to be expected, but the chief scientist began to speak to her in a calm tone, explaining that she was recovering and that it was normal to feel this way. Little by little, he introduced simple information, trying to establish a basis for communication. The scientist then asked a question that made Vader hold his breath outside. "Do you know your name?" Behind the glass, Vader could almost feel the sound of his heart beating faster than ever. He was overwhelmed by a mixture of arousal, anxiety, and emotion that seemed impossible to control. The clone, in a still, weak voice, replied, "Padme." It was as if time had stopped for Vader. That moment was everything he had ever wanted and more. It was done. The impossible had come true. There, before his eyes, was Padme, alive again. All the months of waiting, all the sacrifices, all the pain now made sense. For Vader, that moment represented a rebirth. He was no longer the man destroyed by guilt and regret. He was someone who had overcome his own death. And with that, Padme was reborn too. He felt that he had finally won his battle with himself. After a period of rest, the chief scientist interacted with the clone again. He needed to ensure that everything was in order both physically and mentally. He began to ask more elaborate questions, and the clone answered with a clarity that surprised even the scientists. When he asked, "Where are you from?" the clone replied, "Naboo." Every answer was a confirmation that the process had been an absolute success. Padme's memories, emotions, and even the nuances of her personality were intact. For Vader, every word spoken by the clone was like a song. He felt that not only had he brought Padme back, but that she was exactly as he remembered her. No detail seemed to have been lost in the process. It was as if she had never left. Vader was fascinated, amazed, and, for the first time in years, he felt he had achieved something truly significant. But he knew that, despite everything, this was only the beginning. After weeks of waiting, the moment finally arrived when Vader could see her. The medical team authorized the meeting, ensuring that her consciousness was already sufficiently adapted to the new reality. Vader walked slowly into the room, his heart divided between anxiety and hope. He knew that this moment would be decisive, and each step seemed to weigh tons. When he entered, he saw Padme sitting, looking around with a confused expression. Their eyes met, and the instant she saw him, her expression changed to pure fear. Padme instinctively backed away, frightened by Vader's threatening and imposing figure. He tried to calm her down, saying in a deep but controlled voice, "I'm not going to hurt you." He continued, "I'm the one who asked you to be looked after. You're safe now." Padme looked at him suspiciously and, hesitating, asked, "Who are you?" The tone of her voice revealed a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Vader took a deep breath and answered for the first time in a long time with a name he himself had abandoned. "It's me, Anakin." Those words came out almost as a whisper, but they carried an immense weight. Uttering his real name was a transformative moment for him, as if, for a brief moment, the mask of Vader had been removed. He wasn't just the Sith Lord at that moment. He was the man she loved, or at least wanted to be. Something seemed to be changing inside him. Padme, however, recoiled even more when she heard that name. Denying it with her head, she began to cry, tears streaming down her face. Memories of Anakin began to appear in confused flashes in her mind. Still crying, she mumbled, "Why are you like this? You can't be Anakin." Her mind, still recovering, couldn't process all the information clearly. The memories that emerged were fragmented, and her confusion left her emotionally destabilized. Even with Padme's obvious confusion, Vader felt a silent joy. With each tear, with each expression, he was more certain that Padme's essence was there. For him, there was no doubt that it was her. He felt that, despite all the pain they were both going through, this was a chance to make amends for the past. He wanted her to understand how much he had suffered, how much he still loved her, and, above all, he wanted her to accept the new reality. Still crying, Padme asked, "Why are you doing this to me? Who are you really?" Vader, in the calmest voice he could muster, replied, "I'll tell you. Your body eventually died, and I saw to it that a new body was created for you. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." He knew the truth would be hard to hear, but he believed it was necessary. He wanted her to know about all the effort he had made to get her back. Padme, still confused and incredulous, asked, "If you really are Anakin, why don't you take off that mask?" Vader hesitated for a moment, knowing that this would be a difficult revelation for both him and her. But then, slowly, he removed his mask, exposing the scarred and disfigured face he had hidden for so long. Padme looked at him and, in a mixture of horror and disbelief, shouted, "No, this can't be true." She couldn't accept that this monster was the man she loved. Vader, however, tried to calm her down again, saying, "I know it's hard to believe, but let me prove it. Let me tell you everything we experienced. Things that only Anakin would know." Then he began to recount the most important moments they had shared, things that no one but Anakin could have known. Between tears and sobs, Padme began to believe. The memories connected with the memories she had, and the truth began to form in her mind. The emotional impact was so great that Padme fainted. The chief medical officer quickly entered the room and explained to Vader that this was normal. He said that with each memory activated, an avalanche of hormones and neurotransmitters was released into her body for the first time, triggering intense emotional reactions. That body was receiving those emotions for the first time. Her body and mind were still adapting to all these new sensations. The doctor assured him that, in time, she would return to equilibrium. Following the doctor's recommendation, Vader decided to give Padme the time she needed to recover. He continued to follow her progress closely, visiting her often, but keeping his distance so as not to overwhelm her emotionally. As the days went by, Padme began to move more easily, and her mind seemed to be returning to normal functioning. Every step she took was a relief to Vader, who was now looking forward to rebuilding not only Padme, but also something of himself. After beginning to recover her movements with medical assistance, Padme had another visit from Vader. This time, she was full of questions. She wanted to know what had happened, why some things seemed so confused in her memory. She stared at him and asked, "How did my body die? Why don't I remember?" Vader, hesitant, knew that the truth would be hard to hear, but decided to answer. He needed her to trust him. "You were pregnant with our son. Remember? Your body didn't resist childbirth." Padme looked paralyzed for a moment, until her expression turned to pure terror. "My son, where is he?" For the moment, Padme remembered only her pregnancy. Vader tried to explain, but his voice seemed laden with guilt. "I don't know. Your body was buried with a fake belly. I think someone took our child. I don't know who did it." Padme was silent for a moment, but her mind began to work quickly. The image of Obi-Wan Kenobi came to mind, a hazy memory, but clear enough to create suspicion. However, she decided not to mention anything to Vader. Something in his tone made her not trust him completely. As her memory continued to reorganize itself, two names echoed silently in her mind. Luke, Leia. At that moment, something changed inside Padme. The fragmentation of her memories began to dissipate, and the real Padme, the strong and determined leader, was back. She clearly remembered giving birth to a pair of twins. Everything began to make sense. She looked at Vader, but said nothing. As he talked about the past, she processed the information quickly and understood the gravity of the situation. Her children were alive, and she had to find them, no matter what she had to do. Determined, Padme began to plan a way out of there without Vader realizing her intentions. She knew that he was consumed by an obsessive love and that this was both a weakness and an advantage. In her mind, the next step was clear. She needed to find Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was the only person she could trust to help her provide information about her family and protect her children. But to do so, she would have to trick Vader and escape his control. Padme then suggested to Vader that he take her to Naboo, saying that she wanted to finish her recovery in her homeland. She knew that this request would appeal to Vader's emotional side. He, bewitched by the idea of pleasing her, agreed immediately and decided to accompany her. When she arrived on Naboo, she waited a few days to make Vader feel more confident, pretending that she was adapting and recovering. Then she asked to spend some time alone, arguing that she needed privacy to reflect. Vader, completely overwhelmed by his obsession with Padme, accepted the request, something he would never do in any other situation. During the many conversations they had, always encouraged by her, Vader told her about the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Emperor. He seemed to open his heart in a way he had never done after falling to the dark side. Before leaving, Padme asked a strategic question. "What do you think Palpatine will do when he finds out our son is alive?" The question echoed in Vader's mind as he boarded his ship, unable to answer. On the way to Coruscant, Vader reflected deeply on Padme's words. He knew that Palpatine would not hesitate to destroy any threat to his power, including Vader's son. The thought of losing Padme again and of his children falling into the Emperor's hands stirred something in him. For the first time, the certainty that he needed to eliminate Palpatine became clear. But the question of how to do it still plagued him. He knew that his costume limited him, and the Emperor was too powerful to be defeated easily. Meanwhile, Padme, still on Naboo, was taking advantage of her limited freedom to start taking action. In secret, she contacted former allies and trusted people, explaining her situation and asking for help. To her surprise, her story began to be taken seriously, especially by those who had known her integrity and strength of character in the past. Among the contacts he managed to make, one was particularly crucial: Senator Bail Organa. He was shocked to receive Padme's hologram, initially believing it to be some kind of trap. But as they talked, he began to realize that it was really her. Her voice, her manner, her words, everything indicated that it was the real Padme. Even so, Bail decided to confirm it with his own eyes. He announced that he would personally go to Naboo to find her. Bail Organa's arrival on Naboo represented new hope for Padme. She knew that he was a staunch ally of the resistance against the Empire and that he could help her locate Obi-Wan. Padme, however, had to act with extreme caution. At any moment, Vader could become suspicious of her intentions and everything could fall apart. Even so, she was willing to take the risk. Finding her children and protecting them was her only priority. Arriving secretly at the agreed location, Bail Organa stood motionless for a few seconds when he saw Padme Amidala standing before him. The woman he had believed to be dead, and had admired so much for years in the Senate, was alive. Her eyes carried the same strength he had always known. He walked over to her and said, his voice breaking, "Padme, I'm sorry for everything. But in the midst of all the bad things, I have some good news." Padme remained silent, her heart racing, as Bail continued, "Your children are alive, and I will take you to them." Upon hearing these words, Padme began to cry uncontrollably. She hugged the senator tightly, her gratitude bursting into tears. For the first time since awakening in that new body, she felt there was hope. "Thank you, Bail. Thank you for protecting them," she said through sobs. It was as if a gigantic weight had been lifted from her shoulders. With Bail's help, Padme managed to escape from Naboo and set off for Alderaan. During the journey, Bail told her everything he knew about the events that unfolded after the death of her original body. He explained that Leia was safe with him on Alderaan, while Luke was under the care of Obi-Wan Kenobi on Tatooine. Every detail increased Padme's anxiety, but also strengthened her determination to see her children again. On arriving on Alderaan, Padme was immediately taken to Leia's room. The little girl, who was almost a year old and beginning to speak a few words, was playing with her nanny. When Padme entered, Leia stopped and looked at her curiously. Overcome with emotion, Padme took her daughter in her arms and Leia smiled at her. It was as if an instant connection had been restored between mother and daughter. Padme cried as she stroked Leia's tiny hair. After a few minutes of playing with her daughter, Padme became serious. With a determined look on her face, she handed Leia back to the nanny and set off in search of Bail. When she found him, she said firmly, "I need to see Luke." Bail, surprised by her urgency, tried to calm her down. "Of course, Padme. We're going to Tatooine tomorrow. For now, get some rest and spend more time with Leia." But Padme shook her head, determined. "I need to see him now. I need to see that he's all right." Bail, sensing the non-negotiable tone in Padme's voice, gave in. He knew that her maternal instinct spoke louder, and there was no arguing with it. Without wasting any time, he prepared the ship and they both left for Tatooine that same night. During the flight, Padme remained silent, gazing at the stars and thinking about the moment when she would finally see her son. Her heart was torn between the joy of meeting them again and the fear of what might happen if Vader found them first. Meanwhile, on Coruscant, Vader discovered that Padme had escaped. The news hit him like a blow. He felt a whirlwind of emotions invade his mind, bringing up the same crushing pain he felt when he first believed he had lost Padme. Anger, despair, and frustration consumed him. He felt his connection with the dark side growing again, but now with a different focus. In the midst of the emotional chaos, a single idea emerged: eliminate Palpatine. Vader interpreted this decision as the only way out of his pain. He believed that destroying Palpatine could bring a kind of relief and, at the same time, release his oppression over his plans. Without much thought, he set off for the system where the Emperor's ship was parked. During the journey, his mind was on fire, and his connection with the dark side seemed stronger than ever, fueled by anger and a sense of betrayal. When he arrived at the Emperor's ship, Palpatine greeted him with an expression of curiosity, but also caution. He could feel the disturbance in the Force caused by Vader's presence. With his voice low and calculating, he asked, "What has happened, Lord Vader? I sense a great disturbance in the Force coming from you." Vader continued to approach slowly, without looking away. When he reached the distance where he would normally kneel, he replied, "Yes, Master." Before Palpatine could say anything else, Vader, in one swift movement, activated his lightsaber and attacked. Palpatine, although surprised, was quick enough to defend himself by activating his own saber. The sound of sabers slicing the air echoed through the hall as the two faced each other in a battle that had seemed inevitable for a long time. Vader, driven by rage and desperation, fought like never before, while Palpatine tried to understand what had driven his apprentice to defy him. The confrontation between Vader and Palpatine exploded in the Imperial Hall in a fierce fight. Vader, seized by an overwhelming fury, attacked with intensity, while Palpatine used his dexterity and experience to defend himself. The sound of lightsabers echoed through the vast space, and each blow seemed stronger than the last. Vader's anger was fuel for his strength, and Palpatine, although surprised, did not underestimate the power of the apprentice he himself had molded on the dark side. Realizing that Vader's strength was growing with his anger, Palpatine decided to use one of his most devastating attacks. Force beams began to shoot out of his hands towards Vader, knowing that the weak point of his armor was precisely its vulnerability to electricity. The beams zigzagged around the hall, illuminating Palpatine's face, which flashed a cruel smile as he believed that victory was near. Vader, aware that those rays could easily kill him, used his lightsaber to block the attack. With every step he took towards Palpatine, he concentrated on his anger and the hatred he felt. His determination was such that he managed to advance, even under the pressure of the lightning. As he got closer, the rays began to ricochet and hit Palpatine's own face, deforming it even more. The sound was deafening, and the hall seemed to vibrate with the confrontation. Palpatine, weakened by the very rays that were starting to get out of control, stopped attacking him. It was at that moment that Vader, with a swift and precise movement, split Palpatine's body in half with his lightsaber. The Emperor fell lifeless to the ground. Soon after, Vader felt the impact of the fight on his own armor. Although the beams hadn't hit him directly, they had come close enough to cause considerable damage, forcing him to fall to his knees. Gathering his strength, Vader stood up and walked over to Grand Moff Tarkin with his lightsaber still on. He knew he needed to consolidate his power immediately. To make it clear who was in control, he used the Force to strangle Tarkin from a distance, breaking his neck in front of all the officers present. With his deep, commanding voice, he declared, "The Emperor is dead. I am the new Emperor. I want everyone in the meeting room immediately. Wait for me there." The air became heavy, and none of the officers dared question the order. The high command officers rushed into the meeting room, terrified by what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Vader made his way to his recovery chamber. There, he spent a long time receiving care for the damage he had sustained during the confrontation and overseeing alterations to his suit. He knew he would need to be at full strength to face the challenges ahead, especially the search for Padme and her son. When Vader finally returned to the briefing room, the officers were still there, nervous and unsure of their future. He faced them, and with a firm, authoritative voice, ordered them to devote all their resources to finding information about Padme and her son. Without giving too many details, he explained the essentials and ordered them to carry out their orders immediately. The officers left, still trying to process the new reality under Vader's command. Meanwhile, far away, Bail Organa and Padme were arriving on Tatooine. As they approached Obi-Wan's cave, Padme's heart raced. She knew she was close to meeting Obi-Wan again, and possibly his son. The desert seemed more oppressive than ever, but her goal kept her steadfast. Bail, by her side, also sensed the gravity of the moment that was approaching. When they reached the cave entrance, Bail called out for Obi-Wan. Moments later, the Jedi appeared, hesitant but ready to answer the call. When his eyes met Padme's, he went completely still, as if he had seen a ghost. Padme, crying, walked over to him and hugged him tightly. Obi-Wan was unresponsive, unable to understand what was happening, but feeling the genuine emotion in that gesture. Inside the cave, they sat down, and Bail and Padme quickly explained the story to Obi-Wan. He listened intently, still processing the idea that Padme was alive. When they had finished, Padme asked, her voice heavy with emotion, "My son, Obi-Wan. How is he? Is he all right?" Obi-Wan took a deep breath before answering, knowing that the next conversation would be as crucial as it would be delicate. Obi-Wan smiled at Padme and replied, "Yes, you are. Come, see for yourself." He led her to the entrance of the cave and handed her a pair of binoculars. Pointing in the direction of an isolated house, he said, "Over there, Padme looked closely and saw Luke, sitting in the shade next to the house where Anakin had grown up. He was playing absent-mindedly with an airplane in his hands, while Aunt Beru, whom Padme had met on her visit with Anakin, was nearby. The simple, peaceful scene brought tears to Padme's eyes once again. As she watched Luke through her binoculars, a smile appeared on Padme's face. She looked at Obi-Wan and, overcome with emotion, said, "I need to see him." Obi-Wan hesitated for a moment before asking, "Do you intend to take him?" "It's too dangerous." Padme replied firmly, "Not yet. I just need to see him more closely." Convinced by her sincerity, Obi-Wan agreed and prepared to accompany her home. Bail decided to stay in the cave while Obi-Wan and Padme made their way to the Lars house. When they arrived, Owen and Beru immediately recognized Padme. They were stunned, unable to believe their eyes. Owen was the first to speak, but his voice barely came out. "Padme? How is that possible?" She just smiled and moved closer, letting her presence speak for itself. Without needing words, Padme walked up to Luke, who stopped playing and looked at her curiously. For a moment, Luke remained motionless, as if trying to understand the presence of this woman he had never seen before. But then he began to smile, returning Padme's emotion-filled smile. It seemed that, even at such a young age, the Force was already making a connection with him. Somehow, Luke recognized his mother, just as Leia had recognized her on Alderaan. Padme knelt in front of him, allowing him to touch her while her heart overflowed with happiness. An emotional Beru and Owen invited them in, and they all sat around a simple table. Padme told them everything, from how she survived to her search for Luke. Beru, worried, asked, "Are you going to take him? Will he be safe with you?" Padme shook her head and replied, "I can't. It's too dangerous. Not just because of the Emperor, but because of Anakin." She didn't know, however, that Vader had already killed Palpatine, and that the situation was about to get even more complicated. The afternoon was advancing on Tatooine, and the sun was beginning to set over the sandy horizon. The conversation continued, and Padme was so immersed in the moments at Luke's side that she hardly noticed the time passing. Owen, seeing her connection with his son, asked, "Do you want to spend the night here? I think it would be good for both of you." Padme looked at Luke, who held her hand with an innocent smile, and didn't hesitate to accept. That moment was all she needed. The next morning, Bail and Obi-Wan returned to the Lars house to collect Padme. She said goodbye to Luke with tears in her eyes, trying to smile so that he wouldn't notice her pain. Luke didn't seem to understand that anything was happening, and continued to joke. Padme hugged him one last time and whispered, "I will come back to you, my son." She then left with Obi-Wan and Bail, even though her heart was heavy at leaving him behind. As they left the house, an almost tangible weight took over the atmosphere. In the distance, they saw the imposing figure of Darth Vader, standing like a black statue. The aura of menace he emanated was enough to paralyze everyone. He had managed to track a ship that had left Naboo for Alderaan, and then onto the system where Tatooine was located, and deduced that this would be a possible refuge. When he saw Obi-Wan, Bail, and Padme together, his suspicions were confirmed. Vader approached slowly, and his voice cut through the silence. "Obi-Wan, I should have known you were involved." Padme, trying to divert his attention from Obi-Wan, stepped forward and said bravely, "Anakin, this is Luke, our son." Obi-Wan was protecting him from Palpatine. She avoided mentioning Leia trying to protect her. Vader, however, ignored her attempt to defuse the situation. With his lightsaber already in his hand, he replied, "Protecting? You hid my son from me." His voice sounded like thunder. Without waiting for an answer, he switched on his saber, ready to strike. The red glow of Vader's saber reflected in Obi-Wan's eyes, and he immediately took a defensive stance. He knew that a confrontation was inevitable, but his main focus was on protecting Padme and Luke. Bail instinctively retreated, while Padme, in shock, watched Anakin's figure, now completely consumed by Vader. The desert of Tatooine, which had once seemed vast and calm, was now the scene of yet another crucial battle. Obi-Wan, realizing that the confrontation was inevitable, took the lead and switched on his lightsaber. The blue blade shone brightly against the scorching Tatooine sun. He faced Vader and said firmly, "It doesn't have to be like this, Anakin," but Vader, his voice cold and full of hatred, replied, "Anakin is dead." Without hesitation, he attacked, starting a fierce fight on the sands of Tatooine, in front of the house where he himself had grown up. The blows were swift, brutal, while Obi-Wan fought both to defend himself and to try to appeal to what little humanity Vader had left. Padme, watching the battle, couldn't bear the thought of the violence continuing. In a desperate and extremely risky act, she stepped in between the two, raising her hands and shouting, "No! Stop this, Anakin!" Obi-Wan hesitated, taking a step back, while Vader stared at her in surprise. She continued, her voice heavy with emotion. "The fighting is over? Don't you understand? Is that why you brought me back? To destroy everything again?" For a moment silence reigned. Vader, without unsheathing his saber, asked, "What do you expect me to do?" Padme took a deep breath and answered, trying to remain calm, "I want you to let me raise our son in peace on Naboo. And I don't want you to hurt anyone else that we've always loved." Her voice shook as she said the next words. "You brought me back to make things right, Anakin. I found our son. You did it. Don't ruin everything now." His words seemed to pierce through the layers of hatred that enveloped Vader. He switched off his saber and began pacing back and forth, visibly restless. After a few moments of thought, Vader stopped and said, "All right, you're going to Naboo to raise our son." He then pointed at Obi-Wan and added, "But don't think I've forgotten everything you've done." Tension still hung in the air, but Padme breathed a sigh of relief, feeling that she had avoided the worst. However, she knew that the situation was far from resolved, and that Anakin was still a potential danger to everyone around him. Padme, still worried about Luke's safety, warned, "You have to make sure the Emperor doesn't find out. He can't know about Luke." It was then that Vader revealed, "The Emperor is dead. I killed him. I am now the new Emperor." The revelation shocked everyone. Padme felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that Anakin's desire for power had finally come true. She knew it would change everything, and not for the better. Memories of their conversation on Mustafar came back to Padme's mind. On that occasion, Anakin had said that together they could defeat Palpatine and rule the galaxy. Now, she saw that he was fulfilling that twisted promise, but in a way that destroyed any hope of redemption. She realized that Anakin was even more lost, consumed by an uncontrollable desire for power. It became clear to her that she could not allow him to raise her children. Vader, keeping his promise, ordered an Imperial fleet to escort Padme and Luke to Naboo. Obi-Wan went along as Luke's guardian, even though he knew that his presence had little power against Vader's absolute control. On Naboo, Vader arranged reinforced security around Padme, ensuring that trackers and soldiers monitored her every move. Vader's every protective gesture, however, only increased Padme's emotional detachment, as she saw her freedom being stifled. Although she was safely with Luke, Padme felt Leia's absence as a constant ache. She knew that sooner or later she would have to tell Vader the truth. Lying would only increase the risk if he found out by other means. When Vader returned to Naboo a few days later, Padme confronted him. "I need to tell you something important, but only if you promise to let me raise Luke in peace here on Naboo. You can watch him grow up, but always keep a certain distance." Vader agreed, intrigued, and asked her to reveal what she was hiding. Padme, taking a deep breath, said carefully, "We didn't just have one child. They were twins. We also have a baby girl who is being looked after by Bail Organa on Alderaan." Vader was silent, clearly processing the new information. He seemed surprised that yet another lie had been hidden from him, but he was also pleased that Padme had finally told him the truth. She then asked, "Take me there to bring her back and raise her with Luke." Vader, still reflective, said, "Padme, come with me. We'll rule the galaxy together with our children. We can build a new future." Padme looked at him sternly and replied, I don't agree with the person you've become, Anakin. Leave the Empire behind and let the Republic return." Vader remained silent for a few moments, before finally saying, "Let's go." Padme understood that, despite being by her side, Anakin was not yet strong enough to give up the power he had gained. The internal struggle within him was far from over. Finally, after traveling to Alderaan, Padme managed to bring Leia back to Luke. Now, she could raise her children in safety, surrounded by the peaceful environment of Naboo. Vader kept his word and allowed Padme to raise the children there, but visited occasionally. He always kept his distance, watching Padme and her children take the first steps in their new lives. It was as if he was in constant conflict between his position as Emperor and Sith Lord, and the father he could be. Vader, watching from afar, seemed immersed in his own thoughts. He spent hours in hiding, contemplating Padme and the children as they played in the fields of Naboo. Silently, he wondered what it would have been like if he had made different decisions. What if I had listened to Padme? What if I had trusted Obi-Wan more? These thoughts consumed him, but he knew there was no turning back. He was stuck with the consequences of his choices, even if part of him dreamed of something different. The places Padme chose to play with the children had a deep meaning. They were the same places where she and Anakin first became close, where they exchanged their first passionate glances, and where they married in secret. Seeing her children there, smiling, brought back memories. For a few moments, something of the old Anakin seemed to awaken inside Vader. But the dark side, fueled by his thirst for power, soon suppressed these feelings. He turned away again, as if fleeing from what could save him. A few months passed, and on a sunny day, Padme and Obi-Wan were on the balcony of the palace on Naboo. While Padme was talking about the children's progress, Obi-Wan suddenly stood still, looking out over the huge garden in front of the palace. Padme noticed the change in his expression and, worried, asked, "What's wrong?" He didn't answer, just pointed in the direction of a man walking through the garden. Padme turned and looked at him in shock. The figure approaching was wearing Jedi robes. As he walked, both Padme and Obi-Wan began to recognize his gestures and even the way he walked. Obi-Wan muttered, almost in disbelief, "It can't be." When the man came closer, there was no longer any doubt. It was Anakin Skywalker. Obi-Wan climbed down from the balcony, still dazed, and walked over to him. Anakin, with a big smile, hugged Obi-Wan tightly, taking him by surprise. Obi-Wan, hesitant, responded lightly, still trying to understand what was happening. After releasing Obi-Wan, Anakin looked at Padme. He was still smiling, but his eyes showed a mixture of joy and expectation. He took a few steps towards her and hugged her. Padme, completely paralyzed by shock, couldn't react. Her eyes were wide and she felt as if her mind was spinning in circles. That presence seemed so familiar, so real. It was the first time that body had embraced her great love. But something didn't fit. She knew it couldn't be the real Anakin. Padme, still in shock, began to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Then, finally, she said, "You too?" Anakin smiled and nodded. He then looked back, and both Padme and Obi-Wan followed his gaze. In the distance, they saw the imposing figure of Darth Vader watching in silence. There was no doubt. It was another clone. Padme, now understanding, whispered, "He did to you what he did to me." A few moments later, Vader turned and walked away, without saying a word. Obi-Wan, still trying to process what he had just witnessed, asked, "So he did the same thing to you that he did to Padme?" Anakin replied calmly, "Yes, Master. He did exactly the same to me. But this time, he erased my memory from the moment we were sent to rescue Chancellor Palpatine." He was clearly referring to the mission that resulted in the confrontation with Count Dooku. Obi-Wan looked at Anakin, surprised. "So you don't remember anything else after that day?" Anakin shook his head. "No. My last memory is of getting on the ship to go to the rescue." He said that from that confrontation with Dooku, the dark side began to grow stronger in him. He paused and his countenance became more serious. "But Vader told me everything." He explained what happened after that, how he fell to the dark side, I'm still trying to believe that all that really happened. Anakin continued, his voice now heavier. I don't know what to think. Feels like someone else lived through it. Not me. But at the same time, I feel the weight of these memories as if they were my own. It's confusing, Master. Padme and Obi-Wan exchanged glances. They knew that this new Anakin was Vader's attempt to make things right. Even so, the return of that version of Anakin rekindled deep questions about what was to come. Padme, still trying to process everything that was happening, asked Anakin, what about before? Do you remember? Anakin, with a slight smile on his face, replied, yes, I've been remembering little by little. Padme sighed, surprised at the similarity between their experiences. Just like me, she said, smiling. For the first time in a long time, the two of them laughed together, as if the weight of everything they had lived through had dissipated for a brief moment. Obi-Wan, sensing the intimacy of the moment, gave a small smile and said, I think I'll leave you two alone. Anakin, still laughing, replied, wait. Then, looking at Padme, he asked hopefully, are they here? Padme realized that he was referring to her children and, hesitating for a moment, replied, yes. Anakin, his eyes shining, asked, can I see them? Padme paused for a moment, coming back to reality and considering whether it would be safe. Despite all her doubts, the Anakin in front of her seemed different, radiant, full of life. Unable to resist, she replied, yes. With that, she led him to the room where Luke and Leia were sleeping. Anakin entered the room quietly and stared at the two of them in amazement. He approached them carefully, trying not to wake them. As he watched his children, a tender expression came over his face. Obi-Wan, watching the scene from afar, decided to discreetly go out into the garden, leaving them alone. As he walked through the garden, Obi-Wan was still trying to understand what was going on. His thoughts were confused, divided between joy and apprehension. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed behind him. It seems the boy has been given a new chance. He turned quickly, and his heart almost stopped. Before him stood his master Qui-Gon Jinn, enveloped in a bluish light, like a manifestation of the Force. Obi-Wan stood motionless for a few moments, unable to believe his eyes. Master, he exclaimed, I've been thinking about you so much. Qui-Gon smiled and replied calmly, I've always been here, Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan, still surprised, asked, why have you come now? Qui-Gon replied, now it seems we have a new mission. Obi-Wan frowned, puzzled. Mission, he repeated. Qui-Gon nodded positively and said, yes, it seems that the Force still needs to be balanced. The boy didn't come back for nothing. The Master's words brought a weight to Obi-Wan, who bowed his head, reflecting on the mistakes he had made throughout his journey with Anakin. Sensing his former apprentice's anguish, Qui-Gon said, I know you've made mistakes, Obi-Wan. We all have, but it's time to make amends. Qui-Gon looked at the horizon with an enigmatic gaze and continued, the Emperor still doesn't know the mistake he's made. Anakin was brought back for a greater reason, and perhaps there is still something in him that can change the fate of the galaxy. The Master's words echoed in Obi-Wan's mind, bringing a renewed sense of responsibility and purpose. He looked towards the palace, where Anakin was with Padme and the children, and realized that something new was beginning. There, in that garden illuminated by the soft light of Naboo, a new hope for the galaxy seemed to have been born.